The sun hung low over Cancun, its fiery hues reflecting off the rows of rusted cars that lined the cramped garage on the outskirts of the city. The neighborhood was far from the tourist-filled beaches and luxury resorts. Here, life was a grind. The air smelled of motor oil, burning rubber, and the faint tang of salt carried inland by the sea breeze. Ricardo Moreno, lean and broad-shouldered from years of manual labor, was crouched over the hood of a battered Volkswagen Beetle, his hands blackened with grease. His concentration was absolute, eyes scanning the engine with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle only he could see. A bead of sweat traced a line down his temple, but he ignored it, lost in the familiar rhythm of his work. At 19, Ricardo had already become something of a legend in his neighborhood. He wasn't the loudest or the flashiest, but he didn't need to be. His skill spoke for itself. While his peers struggled to change tires or diagnose faulty spark plugs, Ricardo could dismantle an entire engine, lay its components out like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and rebuild it to purr like new. His dreams were simple: work hard, save money, and someday open his own garage. Maybe he'd find a small house in the quieter part of town, with a porch and a yard big enough for a couple of kids to run around. Love was something he assumed would come naturally, somewhere along the way. For now, though, Ricardo's life was defined by his work. It was all he knew and all he needed. Yet even he couldn't have predicted how easily something as tender as a kiss could transform him. How quickly love, when tangled with betrayal, could plant the seeds of something dark. For now, though, Ricardo was just a young man with small dreams and remarkable talent. Ricardo's favorite car was a gleaming black 1968 Chevrolet Impala, a beast of a machine that stood out among the beat-up sedans and compact hatchbacks that regularly rolled into the garage. The Impala belonged to Antonio, a gruff, middle-aged man with a face weathered by years under the Mexican sun. Antonio never said who the car's real owner was, and Ricardo never asked. It didn't matter. The Impala was perfection on wheels, and Ricardo treated it like a sacred relic every time it came in. The car's lines were sleek, its chrome trim catching the light like a mirror. When it sat in the garage overnight, its presence seemed to dominate the space, casting long shadows under the dim fluorescent lights. Ricardo would stay late on those nights, after everyone else had left. He'd grab a rag, polish the steering wheel, and clean the dashboard until it gleamed like new. When he was sure no one was around, Ricardo would slide into the driver's seat. He'd grip the oversized steering wheel with one hand, letting the other drape casually over the doorframe, the way he imagined rich men in American movies did. Sometimes he'd pretend he held a cigar between his fingers, the imaginary smoke curling lazily into the air. He would smile, closing his eyes for a moment, picturing himself cruising down the coast road in the Impala, the wind in his hair and the sound of waves crashing nearby. But his daydreams always ended the same way, with Ricardo climbing out of the car, locking it carefully, and heading home to his reality. The Impala wasn't his, but that didn't stop him from loving it or treating it with the utmost care. 7 months later, Ricardo returned home one evening to find his mother beaming with excitement. She had arranged for his marriage to Luciana, a shy yet strikingly beautiful woman from a neighboring town. Ricardo, ever the dutiful son, didn't protest. In truth, he was pleased. The idea of building a life with Luciana, someone warm and kind, gave him a sense of purpose beyond engines and wrenches. The wedding was small but joyful, a family affair filled with the scent of marigolds and the sound of laughter. Ricardo wore a crisp white shirt, his hair neatly combed, while Luciana glowed in a simple yet elegant dress. Their union wasn't extravagant, but it was enough. Life after the wedding was everything Ricardo had hoped for. He rose early, working long hours at the garage, and came home each evening to the warmth of Luciana's smile and the smell of home-cooked meals. Their small house was modest but full of love. Ricardo would sit at the table, listening as Luciana talked about her day, her laughter filling the air like music. His days were grueling, filled with sweat and labor, but his nights were soft, filled with the gentle touch and unwavering attention of his wife. 5 years after the wedding, Ricardo Moreno finally realized his dream. The grand opening of Taller Moreno, his very own garage. Nestled on a bustling corner in Cancun, the shop stood as a testament to his relentless hard work and quiet ambition. The sign above the entrance gleamed in fresh paint, and inside, the place smelled of new tools and promise. The leap from employee to business owner hadn't been easy, and Ricardo hadn't done it alone. Antonio, the man who often brought the cherished 1968 Impala to the garage, had one day approached Ricardo with an unexpected offer. The mysterious owner of the Impala, whose identity Antonio still refused to disclose, was willing to lend Ricardo enough money to make his dream a reality. Though Ricardo was wary of taking loans, the offer was too generous to refuse. Within a year, his hard work paid off again. The profits from the garage, along with Ricardo's endless hours of labor, allowed him to buy a modest yet charming house on the edge of town. It was a place he and Luciana could call their own, a symbol of all he had worked for, a beacon of his determination. But unbeknownst to Ricardo, the house wasn't just a milestone. It was the beginning of his downfall. The first cracks in his perfect life appeared subtly, barely noticeable. At first, Luciana's afternoons spent with the neighborhood wives seemed harmless. She was social by nature, and Ricardo didn't begrudge her a bit of companionship. He worked long hours, and if it brought her happiness, who was he to object? But as the months went on, the gatherings grew more frequent, stretching longer into the evenings. Luciana's once infrequent visits turned into daily outings. By the time Ricardo returned home after 12-hour days at the garage, the house would often be empty, save for a faint trace of her perfume lingering in the air. Gone were the hot meals that used to greet him at the door. Gone was the soft glow of her smile as she listened to him recount his day. The warmth that had defined their home began to dissipate, replaced by an eerie coldness. On nights when she was home, Luciana seemed distant, distracted, her attention focused on gossip about the neighbors or the latest trends shared by the women she now called her friends. The evenings they used to spend laughing together, sharing quiet moments over a simple dinner, were replaced with her excuses or complaints of exhaustion. The intimacy they once shared became a distant memory. Ricardo could no longer remember the last time Luciana had touched him the way she used to. When he finally summoned the courage to broach the subject one night, Luciana dismissed him with a curt wave of her hand. "You're always working, Ricardo," she said flatly, "and I'm tired. We can talk about this later." Ricardo had always dreamed of children. A noisy house filled with little feet pattering across the floor, laughter bouncing off the walls. But when he brought up the idea, Luciana's reaction stunned him. She refused outright, her tone sharp and defensive. "No, Ricardo. Not yet," she said firmly. "Why not? We're stable now. We have the house, the garage. What are we waiting for?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. She stood with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not ready," she said. "Do you know what pregnancy does to a woman's body? I can't ruin my figure, Ricardo. Not yet. Maybe not ever." The words hit him like a blow. Luciana's refusal to have children didn't just crush his hopes. It began to unravel the small world he had worked so hard to build. Ricardo had no idea that while he spent his days toiling under the hoods of cars, pouring every ounce of himself into his work, Luciana had found a new rhythm to her life, one that didn't include him. The innocent gatherings with neighborhood wives had evolved into something far more clandestine. The group of women, many of whom had their own frustrations with married life, began venturing out to Cancun's vibrant nightlife. Bars along the strip welcomed them with open arms, their laughter blending with the pulse of music and clinking of glasses. They basked in the attention of strangers, relishing the freedom that came with shedding the expectations of their domestic lives. For Luciana, it was intoxicating. After years of being the dutiful wife, tethered to a man she barely knew before their marriage, these nights out felt like liberation. At first, it was harmless flirtation, an escape from the monotony of her days. But as time went on, Luciana became more deeply entrenched in the group's hedonistic pursuits. The attention of other men, strangers who found her alluring, who didn't ask for commitments or question her choices, gave her a thrill that home no longer did. The more she stepped into this world, the more distant she became from the quiet life Ricardo had built for them. For Ricardo, none of this was visible. He worked long hours at the garage, oblivious to the shadow creeping over his marriage. To him, Luciana was still his everything, the light at the end of each grueling day. She was the dream he had clung to, the anchor that had kept him grounded through years of hard work. It didn't matter to Ricardo that their marriage had been arranged, that he hadn't known her before they exchanged vows. That was in the past. What mattered was the present, and in the present, he loved her with every fiber of his being. He loved her now, whether he had known her well before their wedding or not. He loved her today. Ricardo's life was unraveling, and it showed. His once steady hands now trembled when he worked, and the light in his eyes had dulled, replaced by a shadow of exhaustion and pain. Antonio, the familiar driver of the sleek black Impala, noticed the change immediately. The young mechanic who once hummed to himself while tinkering with engines now worked in silence, his face drawn and distant. One evening, after hours, Antonio arrived at the garage to pick up his car. He found Ricardo sitting on a stool in the corner, staring blankly at the floor, the tools in his hands forgotten. "What's going on with you, kid?" Antonio asked, his gravelly voice breaking the silence. Ricardo shook his head, forcing a weak smile. "Nothing, just tired." Antonio wasn't convinced. He studied the young man for a long moment before clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Let's take a drive." Ricardo hesitated, but eventually agreed. Antonio led him to the Impala, the car gleaming even under the dim lights of the garage. The moment Ricardo slid into the passenger seat, he felt a small pang of comfort. He had always loved this car, and tonight, it felt like a refuge. They cruised through the streets of Cancun in silence, the city alive with the sounds of nightlife. After a while, Antonio pulled over near the coast, where the waves crashed against the rocks in the distance. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a cigar, handing it to Ricardo with a lighter. Ricardo hesitated, then took the cigar, lighting it with shaky hands. The first drag made him cough, but Antonio only chuckled. "It's not about how you start," he said. "It's about how you finish." Something about the moment, the quiet hum of the engine, the scent of the cigar mingling with the salty sea air, the steady presence of Antonio, broke through Ricardo's defenses. Before he knew it, the words came pouring out. He told Antonio about Luciana, about how she had changed, about how distant she had become. They spoke of her refusal to have children, her endless outings, and the gnawing suspicion that had been eating away at him. Antonio listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When Ricardo finally fell silent, Antonio leaned back in his seat, letting out a long sigh. "Kid," he said, "I've seen a lot of things in my line of work. I've seen good people broken by the ones they trust the most." Ricardo turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" Antonio glanced at him, his eyes sharp. "I'm not just some guy who likes cars," he said. "I'm a hitman. I work for someone you don't want to cross. But I know how to find the truth. Surveillance, digging into people's lives. It's part of the job." Ricardo stared at him, stunned into silence. Antonio took another drag of his cigar before continuing. "I can help you. I can find out what your wife is doing when you're not around. But it'll cost you. This kind of work doesn't come cheap." Ricardo didn't even hesitate. "I'll pay," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "The amount might not be in money, but it could be something that you may find it hard to pay. I will pay whatever way. I just want my life fixed." The next day, Antonio began his investigation. He was discreet, tailing Luciana and her group of friends without drawing attention. Within a week, he had seen enough to confirm Ricardo's worst fears. The women weren't just gathering for harmless social outings. They were spending their nights in Cancun's bars, drinking and dancing with strange men. The deeper Antonio dug, the darker the truth became. Luciana, he discovered, wasn't just flirting. She was going home with different men, sometimes twice a week, disappearing into the night and returning only in the early hours of the morning. The pattern was undeniable. Antonio documented everything, each detail a dagger aimed at Ricardo's heart. One evening, Antonio pulled Ricardo aside after hours at the garage. His face was grim as he delivered the news. "I'm sorry, kid," he said. "Your wife, she's not just partying. She's sleeping with other men. Regularly." The words hit Ricardo like a thunderclap, leaving him speechless as the weight of the revelation settled over him. Antonio didn't leave anything to doubt. He was thorough, as men in his line of work had to be. When he sat Ricardo down in the dimly lit garage after hours, his expression was hard, almost apologetic, but his tone was unwavering. "I've got proof," Antonio said. "I didn't want to come to you with just words." From the inside pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a small USB drive and a plain brown envelope. He handed them to Ricardo with a heavy sigh. "Everything's here. Videos, hotel bills, timelines." "I didn't miss anything." Ricardo stared at the items in his hands as if they were burning him. His fingers trembled as he opened the envelope, revealing printed screenshots of hotel reservation confirmations and receipts, Luciana's name glaring at him from the pages. The bills weren't for bars or restaurants, but for rooms rented by the hour at various hotels across Cancun. It wasn't just once or twice, Antonio continued, his voice low but firm. "Different men, different places. You deserve to know the truth." The USB felt heavier in Ricardo's hand than it should have. Antonio motioned toward a laptop sitting on one of the workbenches. "I'll leave you to it," he said, rising from his seat. "Take your time. When you're done, We'll talk about what's next. Ricardo nodded numbly, barely aware of Antonio leaving the room. He plugged the drive into the laptop, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. The first video loaded, and there she was, Luciana, his Luciana, laughing and dancing in a crowded bar, a man's arm draped possessively around her waist. Each clip that followed was worse than the last. There were grainy shots of her entering hotels with different men, her hands slipping into theirs, her face lit with a carefree smile that Ricardo hadn't seen in years. There were timestamps, clear evidence that this wasn't a one-off mistake, but a pattern of betrayal. By the time he reached the end, Ricardo couldn't breathe. His chest felt like it was caving in, the weight of each revelation pressing harder and harder until he thought he might break. He slumped back in the chair, staring at the now-blank laptop screen, the videos and documents replaying in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Luciana wasn't just distant. She wasn't just tired or unhappy. She had been leading a double life, one that had no place for him in it. Ricardo couldn't shake the images from his mind. The videos of Luciana laughing, the hotel bills. Each piece of evidence was like a weight on his chest, suffocating him. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he drove home, the quiet hum of the engine doing little to calm the storm brewing inside him. When he stepped into the house, he found Luciana sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine as if nothing had changed. The room felt colder than usual, the soft lighting now oppressive, heavy with the tension in the air. Luciana. Ricardo's voice cracked as he spoke her name. We need to talk. She glanced up from the magazine, her expression briefly flickering with surprise, but then she regained her composure. What's going on now? She asked, her tone dismissive. Ricardo's heart pounded in his chest as he moved closer, pulling the printed hotel bills from his jacket pocket. You're not even trying to hide it anymore, he said, his voice low but steady. What's this, Luciana? He slammed the bills down on the coffee table. Luciana froze for a moment, her eyes flicking over the documents. Then, a nervous laugh escaped her lips. What is this, Ricardo? Are you spying on me now? This is ridiculous. She stood up, her face twisting in feigned confusion. You've lost your mind if you think. Don't lie to me. Ricardo snapped, his voice louder now. I know everything. The hotels, the men, the lies. This isn't some misunderstanding. His hands clenched into fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. I've been working myself to the bone, and this is how you repay me? You're sleeping with other men, and you can't even have the decency to be honest with me. Luciana's face hardened. For a moment, she said nothing, and then she crossed her arms over her chest. You think you can control me, Ricardo? You think you can dictate my life just because you've worked hard for your little garage? Her voice dripped with disdain. I've spent years listening to you, listening to everyone tell me what to do, how to live. I've had enough. Ricardo blinked in disbelief. Enough? He repeated, his voice catching. You think I'm the one who's been controlling you? I've been working every day for us. I built this life for you, for us, and this is how you repay me. Luciana shook her head, her expression cold and distant now. You think I owe you something because you've been working? I don't owe you anything, Ricardo. I'm free now. Free from your expectations, free from this life you wanted me to live. I'm doing what I want now. Ricardo's breath hitched. Your freedom is built on my money, Luciana. I've made every sacrifice to give you everything, and this is how you repay me. Luciana sneered, the bitterness in her voice cutting through the silence. You think you've been doing me some great favor? You've been buying me things and working to build your precious garage, while I've been trapped in this marriage to a man I hardly know anymore. I didn't ask for this life. Then why didn't you just leave me, Luciana? Ricardo's voice cracked, the weight of his pain too much to bear. Why drag this out? Why betray me like this? She took a step toward him, her face inches from his, her eyes fiery with anger. You want to know why? Because you're weak, Ricardo. You thought I'd stay loyal. You thought I'd be happy with your pathetic little garage, but I've outgrown this life. You've got nothing on me. You want to leave? Go ahead. But don't think I'll go down without a fight. Ricardo stood frozen, his mind racing. The woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life for, had just shattered every ounce of trust and respect he had for her. But it didn't end there. Luciana's voice dropped, filled with venom. If you think you're going to take anything from me in a divorce, think again. I'll tear you apart in court. I'll ruin you with a domestic abuse case if that's what it takes. You'll be the one who loses everything, Ricardo. Not me. The words hit him harder than any betrayal. They were a direct threat to his dignity, his pride, and his future. Slowly, silently, Ricardo turned toward the door. His legs felt like lead, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stay in this house another minute. Luciana called after him, but he didn't look back. His heart was a raw wound, and her words only twisted the knife deeper. He walked out of the house, the cold air outside feeling like a relief after the suffocating atmosphere inside. As he closed the door behind him, Ricardo knew that his life was never going to be the same again. As Ricardo walked back to his home later that evening, his thoughts were clouded with confusion and pain. His mind was still reeling from the confrontation with Luciana, the harsh words she had thrown at him like daggers, and the weight of the betrayal settling in his chest. He didn't know where to go or what to do, but he couldn't stay away for long. Despite everything, his home, his once safe space, was where he thought he belonged. When he entered the house, something felt off. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the walls. The air was thick with tension, and he immediately felt the unease creeping up his spine. He reached for the door to the living room, but before he could take another step, a heavy weight slammed into him from behind. In an instant, he was overwhelmed. His body was forced to the ground, the breath knocked out of him as strong hands gripped him. He struggled, but there were too many, 5 men, all of them larger and stronger than him. They began kicking and punching him, their fists landing like hammers against his ribs, his face, his chest. Ricardo tried to fight back, but it was no use. His head spun, and the pain quickly became unbearable. "You thought you could put her down," one of the men sneered as he threw another punch to Ricardo's side. "She's ours now." Ricardo's vision blurred as blood dripped from his lip, but he couldn't comprehend what was happening. Luciana's lovers, each one taking turns to strike him, to break him down both physically and mentally. The men quickly overpowered him, dragging him across the floor toward the center of the room. Ricardo's arms and legs were bound tightly to a chair with rough rope, his body barely able to move. His head hung low, pain radiating from every part of his being. Blood stained his clothes, and his breath was shallow and ragged. He was trapped, helpless. The world around him spun as he tried to focus, but all he could hear were the men's cruel taunts and Luciana's laughter in the background. The love he had once thought was real now seemed like a distant memory, a life that no longer belonged to him. The room felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Ricardo's heart pounded in his chest, his mind fighting against the reality of the situation, desperate for a way out. But there was no escape now. He was tied to the chair, his body bruised and broken, and the only thing he could do was endure. Then she walked into the room, wearing a robe and nothing underneath. "You see, I am a sexy goddess and I am supposed to be loved by not a mere individual like you. I need lots of love. So, my dear husband, today I am going to show you how men should love a goddess." For the next 2 hours, she proceeds to have sex with all 5 of the men in the room. "Now, my dear husband, you are a mere cuck, my slave." Ricardo, battered and bloodied, sat slumped in the chair, his body aching from the brutal assault. His eyes were half-lidded, the pain nearly blinding him, but there was a fire burning deep inside him that refused to die. He gritted his teeth and, despite the throbbing pain in his ribs, forced the words out. "If I live through this," his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "If I live to see another day," his eyes locked onto Luciana's, the woman he had loved and built his life for, the one who had just shattered everything he believed in. "I swear to you, I will become your worst nightmare. I will unleash hell on you. Everything you've done to me. It won't go unanswered." Luciana stood there, her expression twisting into one of disgust and fury. She stared at him for a long moment, a wicked smile forming on her lips. But instead of being intimidated, her anger only seemed to escalate. She turned to the men, who had been silent observers until now, and snapped, "Beat him again." The men hesitated for a brief moment, surprised by the viciousness in her command, but they quickly followed her order, delivering one final, savage blow to Ricardo. The pain was unbearable, but through it all, Ricardo didn't flinch. He didn't beg. His body might have been broken, but his spirit remained defiant. His gaze never wavered from Luciana, and despite the darkness closing in, he held on to the promise he had just made. This was not the end. It couldn't be. Luciana, now standing just a few feet away from him, was livid. The anger in her eyes burned bright, but something in Ricardo's words seemed to rattle her. She clenched her fists, her face twisted with frustration. She could feel the tension in the room, but she refused to acknowledge the faintest shred of fear. She was the one in control now. The men stood back, waiting for her orders. But Luciana's face was twisted in a mix of rage and disbelief. She had pushed him to the brink, but Ricardo's words had struck a nerve she wasn't prepared for. The smug satisfaction she had once felt began to waver, replaced by an uncomfortable feeling she couldn't shake. The men who had attacked Ricardo believed they had finished what they started. They threw him like an unwanted ragdoll near the canal, his body limp and broken from the brutal assault. The night was cold, and the rushing water of the canal added a chilling atmosphere to the scene. They walked away, confident that he wouldn't survive the night, leaving him there to die in silence. However, what they didn't know was that Antonio's men had been keeping a close watch on the entire situation. They had been following the group from a distance, tracking their every move, knowing that Ricardo might need help, and sure enough, they found him, barely breathing and barely alive, but still clinging to life. They moved swiftly, pulling Ricardo from the canal and into their van, making sure no one saw them. They drove him to a safe location, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might recognize him. Antonio was already there, waiting for them, a silent urgency in his demeanor as he oversaw the operation. "Get a doctor. Now." Antonio's voice was firm, but there was a strange sense of relief when he saw that Ricardo was still breathing. His men set Ricardo down carefully on a table, making sure not to jostle him too much, as the doctor arrived shortly after. The doctor immediately began working, checking Ricardo's pulse, assessing the damage. "He's in bad shape," the doctor muttered, shaking his head as he moved to clean the deep cuts on Ricardo's face and tend to his broken body. "But he's not dead. That's a miracle in itself." Hours passed, with Antonio remaining at the warehouse, refusing to leave. He paced back and forth, constantly asking the doctor for updates. By morning, Ricardo's eyelids fluttered open, his vision blurry at first. He tried to move, but every part of his body screamed in protest. He groaned in pain, forcing his eyes to focus. The first thing he saw was Antonio, standing by his side, his face a mixture of concern and relief. "Easy, Ricardo," Antonio said quietly, his voice soft but firm. "You're alive. You're going to make it." Ricardo blinked slowly, confusion clouding his thoughts. I'm alive," he whispered hoarsely. The doctor, who had been tending to his injuries, looked over at him and nodded. "It's a miracle you're awake, Ricardo. Your body took a lot of damage, but you're stronger than you look." Ricardo's mind was foggy, still processing the events that had led him here. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, broken and battered, but somehow still holding on. The pain was constant, but there was a strange sense of relief in knowing that he had survived. Antonio's gaze never left him. "Luciana, she did this. She let them do this to me," Ricardo muttered, barely able to form the words. Antonio nodded grimly, his jaw clenched. "She'll pay for what she's done. But right now, we need to focus on getting you back on your feet. You've got bigger things ahead, Ricardo. Things you can't even imagine yet." Ricardo closed his eyes, exhaustion overtaking him as he lay back down. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anyone get away with what had happened. Not Luciana, not the men who'd beaten him, and not anyone who thought they could destroy him. For now, he would rest. But soon, his promise would be fulfilled. 2 days had passed since the brutal assault on Ricardo, and Luciana, unaware of his survival, was still going about her life as if nothing had changed. But that afternoon, everything began to unravel for her. Luciana walked to the bank, as she often did, to check on her accounts, thinking of the shopping spree she had planned for the weekend. But as soon as she swiped her card, the machine displayed an error. Frowning, she tried again, but the same message appeared. Card declined. Her stomach churned with unease. She quickly checked her phone, pulling up her bank app to find that all her accounts had been frozen. The balance was at zero. She tried calling the bank, but the lines were busy. Panic started to claw at her chest. How could this happen? Her first thought was to call Ricardo, but her phone buzzed with a new message, a text from her lawyer. It simply read, "You need to vacate the house immediately. It no longer belongs to you. The property has been transferred to someone named Gabriel." Luciana froze, staring at the screen as disbelief flooded her. She tried to shake it off, thinking it might be some mistake, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. With a rush of adrenaline, she raced home, hoping against hope that the message was wrong. When she arrived at the house, she was met by a strange man standing at the front door, a suitcase in hand. "I'm sorry, but you need to leave," he said firmly, his voice cold and final. "This house belongs to Mr. Gabriel now." Luciana's face turned pale. "What do you mean it belongs to Gabriel?" she demanded, her voice rising with frustration. "I live here. I've lived here for years. There's no way." The man interrupted her, showing her the official paperwork, his expression unbothered. "I'm just following instructions. You have until the end of the day to vacate." Her mind raced, her chest tightening with panic and fury. "Who the hell is Gabriel?" she spat, feeling her world begin to spin out of control. She turned on her heels, determined to confront the person responsible for this. Maybe it was some mistake. Maybe Ricardo had done something, but she couldn't believe he would go so far. She drove to the garage, hoping it was business as usual, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. But when she arrived, the doors to the garage were locked. A small sign hung on the door, indicating that the property had been sold. Underneath the name of the new owner was the same name from earlier, Gabriel. Luciana stood frozen in front of the garage, the weight of the situation finally crashing down on her. Her hands trembled as her mind spun with disbelief and frustration. Everything she had worked for, everything she had relied on, was slipping through her fingers, and she had no idea who this Gabriel was or why he was targeting her. Her pulse quickened as anger bubbled up inside her. She could feel the rage building, the helplessness turning into something darker. She knew that Ricardo had survived, that somehow, he was behind all of this. Luciana, filled with frustration and anger, didn't know where to turn. She needed someone who might offer her a semblance of comfort in the chaos. Her thoughts raced as she dialed the number of one of her lovers, hoping he could provide an escape, even if only for a brief time. When he answered, his voice was calm, even though she could hear the undertone of concern. "Luciana? What's wrong?" "Please, just come get me," she said, her voice shaky with a mix of emotions. "I can't do this anymore. I need to get out of here." Within minutes, he arrived at her doorstep. She barely said goodbye to the house. Her house, now no longer hers, and slipped into the passenger seat of his car. The drive was quiet, her mind swirling with confusion and anger over everything that had happened. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, but there was little she could do about it now. He took her to his house, a place she had visited before in secret, but never under these circumstances. It was quiet and secluded, offering a temporary refuge from the chaos of the world outside. As soon as they entered, Luciana slumped onto the couch, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. "Tell me what happened," he said, taking a seat beside her. She hesitated, fighting to hold back the tears. But it all came rushing out. She told him about the bank accounts, the house, the garage, how everything had been taken from her, all at once, how she'd been blindsided, feeling helpless and exposed. She spoke of Ricardo, of how she had pushed him away and never imagined he would retaliate this way. Her lover listened intently, but there was a coldness in his eyes as she spoke. Luciana had always enjoyed the attention and excitement that came with these secret affairs, but now, even his presence felt like a fleeting distraction from the unraveling nightmare she found herself in. As she finished speaking, he leaned back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "This isn't over, you know? You won't let it be." Luciana's gaze met his, but her mind was elsewhere, fixated on what Ricardo had done. He was alive. He was out there, and he was turning everything she had against her. The fury in her chest flared once more. "I won't let him get away with this," she muttered, more to herself than to him. But despite her anger, there was a creeping unease in the pit of her stomach. She knew that what was happening now, what she had caused, was far from over. It wasn't just about her freedom. It was about something darker, something she had underestimated. 3 weeks had passed since Ricardo's near-death experience, and he had made significant strides in his recovery, both physically and mentally. The warehouse where Antonio had taken him had become his refuge, a place where he could focus solely on his survival and what lay ahead. Antonio, who had taken a deep interest in Ricardo's transformation, had become more than just a mentor. He had become a guide through the darkness that Ricardo had stepped into. Under Antonio's watchful eye, Ricardo learned things he never thought possible. He was taught how to handle weapons, guns, knives, and even a machete. Antonio showed him how to clean and maintain them, how to use them efficiently, and how to move with precision. Each lesson was hard, demanding, but necessary. Antonio's training pushed Ricardo beyond his limits, shaping him into someone unrecognizable from the man he had been. It was no longer about repairing cars or dreaming of a family. This was about survival and power. After weeks of intense training, Ricardo's body had become leaner and stronger. His mind was sharper, more focused. He had become a force to be reckoned with, no longer a mechanic or a victim of betrayal, but a man prepared to take what was rightfully his. It was then that Antonio took him to meet Gabriel, the man who had helped him with money for his garage years ago, and who now, unbeknownst to most, was a powerful figure in the criminal underworld. A mob boss with connections and influence in every corner of the city. Gabriel was the one who had been quietly watching over Ricardo, pulling strings behind the scenes, ensuring that the right opportunities came his way. And now, he was ready to test Ricardo's resolve. The meeting took place in a private, dimly lit room at one of Gabriel's many properties. Gabriel, a man with a commanding presence, sat behind a large oak desk, his fingers steepled in front of him as he observed Ricardo. He had a reputation for being methodical, patient, and unforgiving. A man who only made deals with those who truly understood the cost of loyalty and vengeance. "You've come a long way, Ricardo," Gabriel said, his voice deep and steady. "I've watched you work hard, lead an honest life, watched you survive. But now, we're at a crossroads. You've got choices to make." Ricardo stood in front of him, his posture unwavering. His hands rested at his sides, each finger subconsciously touching the weapons that had become an extension of himself. He had come to understand the weight of those choices, but he knew exactly what path he wanted to take. Gabriel leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Ricardo's face. "You've been through hell. You've lost everything, your home, your wife, and your pride. But now you've got a chance to take it all back. You can choose a new life, a clean slate, a divorce, freedom from Luciana and everything she did to you." He paused, letting the silence stretch out. "Or you can choose revenge. And if you choose revenge, there's no turning back. It's a one-way path, Ricardo. You'll have to give up your humanity, become something else. A killer. A man who lives by the law of the streets." The question hung in the air, heavy with consequence. Gabriel wasn't offering him a choice in the way most people would understand it. This was a decision that would define Ricardo's future, a line in the sand that could not be crossed back over. Ricardo didn't hesitate. He had already made up his mind. His thoughts were clear, the anger still burning beneath the surface, the desire for justice. No, for vengeance. Stronger than anything else. The life he had once dreamed of was now gone, replaced with something darker. "I've decided," Ricardo said, his voice low but firm. "I want revenge. I want to make her pay for everything she's done. For what she did to me, for what she's done to my life. I'll give up anything to make her suffer, to make her understand the cost of betrayal." Gabriel studied him for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. "So be it," he said, his voice cold. "Revenge is a dangerous path, Ricardo. But once you walk down it, there's no turning back. You'll have to become someone else, someone who's capable of doing what's necessary. There's no room for weakness." Ricardo's heart beat in his chest, a surge of adrenaline rushing through him. There was no fear in his heart, only the certainty that he had made the right choice. Luciana had taken everything from him, and now it was time for her to feel the consequences of her actions. As Gabriel gave him a long, appraising look, the wheels of destiny began to turn, and Ricardo knew that his life had changed forever. He had chosen revenge, and now he would become the man capable of delivering it. Luciana sat in her lover's living room, the dim lighting of the apartment casting long shadows over the furniture. She had spent the afternoon with him, trying to numb herself from the chaos of her life, but her mind kept racing back to what had happened. Ricardo was still out there somewhere, and she couldn't shake the feeling that his silence meant something darker was coming. She had underestimated him, and now she felt the weight of that mistake pressing down on her. She was distracted, her thoughts swirling, when the doorbell rang. It was strange for anyone to be at the door, especially someone she knew. But when she opened it, there was no one in sight. Only a small package, wrapped in red paper, was lying on the ground. Luciana glanced around cautiously, but quickly bent down to retrieve it. The sight of the package, with its familiar red wrapping, something Ricardo used to give her on special occasions, sent a shiver down her spine. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she untied the string holding it closed. Something felt wrong. Something wasn't right. Inside, her heart dropped when she saw what lay in the box. A severed male organ, wrapped carefully in tissue, rested in the center. The sight of it made her stomach churn, and she felt bile rise in her throat. Her hand shook as she reached for the note that had been tucked beside the grotesque gift. She unfolded the paper, the words scrawled in black ink sending a chill through her. "You have just unleashed hell. 1 down, 4 to go. Go to the cops and you will be next." Her vision blurred as she read the note again, disbelief mixing with terror. The words, the implication, they were undeniable. Ricardo had returned, and he wasn't coming for her in any way she had imagined. He wasn't here to beg or plead for reconciliation. He was here for something far worse. Luciana's mind raced. She dropped the note, her hands trembling violently as she staggered backward. The apartment, once a safe haven, now felt suffocating. She couldn't breathe. A cold sweat clung to her skin as her vision began to narrow, and panic crept in. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, too fast, too erratic. Her body trembled as the terror set in, but there was no escape from it. She had pushed him too far. The room spun, the edges of her vision darkening as her breath became shallow. Her body felt heavy, the blood rushing from her head, leaving her lightheaded and disoriented. The final thought that crossed her mind before everything went black was simple and terrifying. What had I done to him? Luciana collapsed to the floor, the note still lying beside her, her body going limp as unconsciousness took her. Luciana slowly regained consciousness, the fuzzy edges of the room becoming clearer as her lover helped her sit up. Her head throbbed, and her body still felt unsteady from the shock of what she had just discovered. She barely registered the words coming from her lover, but then he said something that made her attention snap back to reality. Diego's dead. They found his body outside the city, he said, his voice tight, his face pale as he knelt beside her. Someone must have been after him, too. Luciana's heart sank. Diego had been a part of their small circle of lovers, someone she had known for a while. His brutal death only confirmed her worst fears. Someone was out for revenge, and now they were part of it. Without saying much, Luciana reached for the red box that had been left for her on the table. Her hands shook as she opened it again, revealing the same grotesque token, along with the cruel note. Her stomach churned at the sight of it again, and she felt herself slipping into panic. The message was clear. Whoever had sent this was making it personal. The threat was real, and it was growing. She wasn't safe, not even in the confines of the apartment. Her lover, looking at the note, made a quick decision. "We need to leave," he said, his voice firm but with an underlying tremor. "We can't stay here. If they're willing to do this to Diego, we're next." Luciana didn't argue. She knew he was right. She had pushed Ricardo too far, and now it was all spiraling out of control. She grabbed what she could, and they both rushed out of the apartment, taking the car and driving in haste, trying to put as much distance between them and the city as they could. Their destination was Bacala, a quiet town known for its serene lagoons, far enough from the chaos of the city to give them a brief respite. They found a small, nondescript motel on the edge of town and checked in, hoping for a moment of peace. The place was isolated, just what they needed to lay low for a while. But the peace was short-lived. That evening, just as the night settled in and the air grew thick with the silence of the small town, a knock echoed on their motel door. Luciana froze. Her heart raced. Her lover stood up quickly and went to the door, peering through the peephole. There, on the ground in front of their door, was another box. The sight of it made Luciana's stomach drop. She wasn't ready for whatever it contained, but she couldn't ignore the dread that had already settled in her chest. Her lover opened the door cautiously, picked up the box, and brought it inside. Luciana, hands trembling, could barely look as he opened it. What lay inside was even more grotesque than before. 6 testicles, wrapped in dark cloth. Her eyes widened in horror. The cruelest part, however, was the note that accompanied it. She read aloud, her voice shaking with fear. "For your necklace, you can run to the edge of the world, but I will always be there." The final words echoed in the small motel room, a cold chill filling the air. Luciana stared at the note, the message unmistakable. No matter how far they ran, no matter where they went, they could never escape. "I'll always be there." It was a haunting promise, one that ricocheted in Luciana's mind, louder with every passing second. Ricardo wasn't just after her. He had become something far more dangerous, relentless, and omnipresent. Her lover gripped her shoulders, his face pale with realization. "We need to leave. Now," he said, his voice panicked. But Luciana knew it was too late. They couldn't outrun what they had unleashed. Luciana had spent the last 3 days locked inside the motel room, her mind spiraling into a constant state of paranoia and fear. The walls, once a semblance of safety, now felt like a cage. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't even look out the window without expecting to see someone watching her. The weight of the news about Alejandro, Juan, and Daniel had crushed her resolve. their brutal deaths a grim reminder of the darkness that was closing in around her. Emiliano had been on edge, too, constantly pacing the small room or checking his phone for any updates. He hadn't spoken much about the killings, but the air between them was thick with unspoken dread. On the fourth day, Emiliano left the room. He'd gone to get food, something simple to keep them going, but hours passed and he hadn't returned. Luciana tried to distract herself, but the clock seemed to mock her with every passing minute. The silence in the room grew unbearable. She found herself pacing back and forth, her hands trembling with anxiety. The nagging thought that something had happened to him gnawed at her. 3 hours later, Luciana could no longer sit still. Panic gripped her chest, and she knew that something was wrong. Her instincts, now finely tuned to the danger surrounding her, screamed that Emiliano had been taken, or worse. She couldn't wait anymore. She had to find him. Without thinking clearly, she grabbed the car keys and rushed out of the motel room. The hot desert air slapped her face as she stepped outside, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed with finding Emiliano, with making sure he was okay. She jumped into the car and drove off, her hands tight on the wheel as her heart pounded in her chest. The further she drove, the more isolated the world around her became. The landscape of Ciudad Juarez stretched out before her, dusty and empty, the streets growing more desolate as she ventured further from the city. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror constantly, afraid someone might be following her, afraid she might already be too late. She wasn't sure where she was going, but her mind kept pulling her toward the vast expanse of the Chihuahuan Desert. It was a place that felt both terrifying and somehow comforting in its emptiness, where one could get lost and never be found. It was as if her desperation had led her to this barren, unfeeling place where she could bury herself in the quiet and escape from the torment. The highway stretched on endlessly, the horizon hazy in the distance. Luciana's thoughts spun faster, the silence in the car almost deafening. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her. Ricardo's vengeance, the lives lost, the constant fear, and it was suffocating. With each mile, she felt more detached from the world she knew. The city was far behind her now, the lights fading into the dust, and ahead lay only the vast, open desert. As she drove deeper into the Chihuahuan Desert, her mind couldn't shake the thought that she was running from something much bigger than herself, something she could never outrun. She pushed the car further, her eyes now focused on the endless road, unsure if it was a road to salvation or one that would lead her deeper into the nightmare she had unleashed. Luciana's heart raced as she stumbled through the endless desert, her body pushing beyond its limits. She had been walking for over 2 hours now, each step dragging her further into exhaustion. The oppressive heat was suffocating, and her parched throat burned with thirst, her legs giving way beneath her as the sun bore down relentlessly. Every part of her screamed for rest, but there was no time. She had to keep moving. Her thoughts were fragmented, her mind a blur of fear, regret, and a growing sense of hopelessness. The desert stretched out before her, an unforgiving landscape that seemed to go on forever, and with each step, she felt more disconnected from the world she had once known. She could hear her breathing, harsh and labored, as the weight of the last few days crushed down on her. Then, in her delirium, she thought she saw it, a shimmer on the horizon. A mirage, perhaps, but it called to her. Water. She didn't care if it was real or not. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. She ran, her legs aching, her vision blurring with the heat, but as she reached it, her hands grasped at the empty air. It was an illusion. The mirage vanished, leaving her with nothing but a cruel reminder of her desperation. She fell to the ground, gasping for air, tears stinging her eyes. The heat was unbearable, and her mind was slipping further. She was on the edge of collapse when, almost miraculously, she saw another figure through the haze. A black SUV appeared in the distance, its silhouette cutting through the shimmering air. Luciana blinked, convinced it was just another trick of the desert. She collapsed to the ground, unable to keep her eyes open any longer. But the SUV didn't vanish. It came closer, the sound of the engine growing louder. Her pulse quickened, but her body refused to move. She was too weak to react. The vehicle came to a stop beside her, the dust swirling around the tires as the doors swung open. Luciana barely registered what was happening. Her eyes unfocused, her head spinning, until she felt a cold weight drop onto her lap. Her breath hitched, and her gaze fell to the gruesome sight. It was Emiliano's head, his lifeless eyes staring up at her, the blood still fresh on his neck. His hair matted with crimson, his face contorted in an expression of fear or pain. Luciana couldn't tell. The vehicle didn't linger. Without a word, the door slammed shut, and the SUV revved its engine, kicking up a cloud of dust as it sped off, leaving Luciana alone in the unforgiving desert with only the horrifying proof of what had just happened. Her hands trembled as she clutched Emiliano's severed head, her heart pounding in her chest, but no tears came. Her throat was too dry, her mind too numb to process the brutal reality of what she was holding. The blood soaked into her lap, staining her clothes and burning her skin with the cruel reminder of the vengeance she had triggered. The desert around her felt even more isolating now. It was a place where she couldn't escape, a place where her actions and their consequences had caught up to her. The head of the man who had been her lover was all that remained of him, and it was now her only company in the vast emptiness. Luciana sat there, frozen, unable to do anything but stare at the body that had once been so full of life, wondering just how much further this nightmare would drag her. Luciana's breath was ragged as she stumbled through the desert, her mind a fog of panic and exhaustion. She had no direction, no plan, only the overwhelming need to escape, to outrun whatever nightmare had been chasing her. The sun beat down mercilessly, the oppressive heat consuming her every step, and her body was starting to give out. Her mouth was parched, her skin burning under the relentless sun. Her legs wobbled, the strength draining from her muscles, and after what felt like an eternity, she collapsed again onto the hot ground. She didn't have the strength to get up. Her thoughts were a haze, her body screaming for water, for relief from the endless torment she had brought upon herself. She was alone. There was no one left. No escape. Then, just as she was sinking into the depths of despair, she saw him. Ricardo, standing a few feet away, as if from nowhere, his silhouette carved against the endless desert. Her heart skipped a beat, and she pushed herself up, her legs shaking as she ran toward him. It's him. He's here. He came to find me. But as she neared him, her breath hitching with desperate hope, he faded, disappeared into the shimmering heat like a mirage, leaving only the harsh desert stretching out before her. Her chest tightened in disbelief, but there was no time to process it. She couldn't let herself stop. She couldn't give up now, but her body betrayed her. She barely made it a few meters before her vision swam, and the ground gave way beneath her. She plummeted into a hole, her body crashing into the dirt, her limbs twisted at an awkward angle. The impact left her dazed and disoriented, lying there in the dark pit she had fallen into. For several long minutes, she lay there, trying to gather her bearings. The desert sun above felt so far away now, the weight of it still pressing down on her. Her mind was fragmented, unable to make sense of what was happening. How had she fallen? Where was she? And then, a shadow loomed over her. Ricardo. He was standing at the edge of the hole, looking down at her with cold, detached eyes. Luciana's mouth opened, her lips cracked and dry, but no sound came out. She tried to speak, to beg him for mercy, but the dryness of her throat swallowed any words. All she could do was stare at him, the person she had once known, the man who had loved her. Now, he was nothing but a shadow, a figure of vengeance. Ricardo didn't move for a moment, just stood there, staring down at her. And then, he made a single gesture with his hand. The sand. It began to shift, slowly at first, then with growing intensity. The sand from the desert floor poured into the hole, filling it up, pushing in around her. Luciana screamed, but the sound was lost in the ever-growing desert around her. The grains of sand pressed in on her body, covering her legs, then her chest, choking her, suffocating her. She could still see him, standing above her, but the image grew blurry as the sand filled the space. The darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. Her pulse quickened, but her body was too weak to resist. She tried to claw her way out, but the sand was relentless, swallowing her whole. Her breath was shallow now, her chest tightening as the world around her blurred into nothingness. Ricardo's figure faded into the horizon, his silhouette the last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her completely. Ricardo was no longer the man he used to be. The man who once loved, who had dreams, hopes, and the simple desire for a peaceful life. He was gone. In his place stood Cazador del Desierto, the desert hunter, a name that sent a chill through anyone who heard it. His eyes, once filled with warmth, now only reflected cold emptiness, a void where emotions once lived. Under Gabriel's rule, Ricardo had been melded into something much darker. His transformation was complete when he embraced his new identity. The desert became his home, a vast, unforgiving expanse where he hunted, tracked, and killed with precision. The world knew him as a ruthless hitman, feared by those who crossed Gabriel and those who stood in the way of his cartel. He did not flinch when he pulled the trigger or when he made the final cut with a knife. His hands were stained with blood, but it no longer mattered. Cazador del Desierto had no room for doubt, for mercy, or for hesitation. He had learned that in the harsh world of the cartel, his loyalty to Gabriel was unwavering. His respect for the man who gave him the power to get revenge against Luciana was beyond measure. Gabriel had given him everything: wealth, status, and a purpose. In return, Ricardo served him faithfully, becoming one of the most feared lieutenants in Gabriel's army. His missions were methodical, each kill a step towards solidifying his position. There were no emotions left in him, only the cold drive for destruction. The pain of the past had been buried under layers of bloodshed and brutality. Every life he took, every enemy he crushed, was a step further away from the person he had been and closer to the monster he had become. To the people in the desert and beyond, Cazador del Desierto was a myth, a specter who haunted the darkness. He was a force of nature, as unforgiving as the desert winds themselves. His name struck fear into the hearts of men who had once been bold, once had a sense of invincibility. But in the face of Cazador, that fear was all-consuming. And though his past remained buried beneath the sands of the desert, there was one truth that remained unshakable. He had become exactly what he vowed to be. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.